Well, it's 1 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Thank you very much for joining us today for the discussion on Southeast Asia's counter strategies to China, a key topic that looks at the relationship not from the perspective of the dominant power or great power competition, but focus on the small and the weak, on how Southeast Asian countries develops and pursues different strategies to counter China's growing influence and encroachment over their sovereignty, security, and economic future. Many people might have a fatalistic view that Southeast Asia is predestined to fall under the Chinese sphere of influence, given the tremendous power imbalance and the geographical proximity. More recently, however, there are an increasing number of studies that suggest that such relationships are not a one-way street where China dictates the terms and Southeast Asia passively accepts. In fact, the smaller countries have plenty of venues and leverages to negotiate more optimal outcomes for themselves. My name is Yun Sun, and I'm the director of China program and co-director of East Asia program here at the Stimson Center. Today, to unpack these key issues and characteristics of Southeast Asia's counter strategies to China, we have three leading experts on Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia-China relations to share with us their research findings. To begin with, we have Professor Don Emmerson, who is a senior fellow emeritus at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and director of the Southeast Asia program at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. His most recent book, released this past summer, The Deer and the Dragon, Southeast Asia and China in the 21st Century, reviews how Southeast Asia is the agile and smart mouse deer and leverage their advantages vis-a-vis China as a big dragon from the north. Secondly, we're having Murray Hiebert, who is a senior associate from the Southeast Asia program at CSIS. Mr. Hiebert is the author of Under Beijing's Shadow, Southeast Asia's China Challenge, which has also been released this past summer. His book, perhaps the most comprehensive as for a review of contemporary relations between China and 10 Southeast Asian countries, is a must read for all students of the region. Last but not least, we have had the pleasure to invite Mr. Joshua Kurlantzick from Council on Foreign Relations, who is a senior fellow for Southeast Asia as a council, to join us as a discussant and also my co-host of the event today. He is working on an extremely illuminating book project on China's soft power influence campaigns across Southeast Asian countries, its effectiveness and its impact on Southeast Asia. So thank you all for joining us. To begin with, Don and Murray, your books have both presented a much more nuanced picture on how the region has been working to push back, while some being more successful than others. There's not a one standard story across 10 Southeast Asian countries, given their different historical relations with China, development and legitimacy needs of the governments, and the availability of alternative international support. From deference on one extreme to alliance against China on the other. The options that we have seen from Southeast Asia include at least bandwagoning, hedging, soft balancing, and hard balancing. So Don, may I invite you to share your perspectives on this issue first? You have 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for organizing this. I appreciate it. I look forward to hearing the comments by my colleagues. And I think the plan here is for Murray to go into particular detail with regard to country by country situations. And so let me give a kind of an overview here. There is a sort of scale of degrees of opposition or cooperation between, let's say, Southeast Asian countries and China that it may be helpful to keep in mind. And you've just alluded to it, soft balancing, hard balancing. I mean, think of this, opposition, outright opposition, right? Accommodation, acquiescence, and I think we have to include complicity. And the reason I add complicity is in part because of a remarkable statement made very recently by Bilahari Kosika, whom some of you know and many of the audience will have heard of, an absolutely superb thinker and writer, former diplomat in Singapore. And Bilahari Kosika, just a few days ago, raised a possibility that, to my knowledge, and Josh and Murray and you, Yun, can correct me if I'm wrong, a possibility that has never been mentioned before, at least in public discourse. And that is the possibility that ASEAN might actually expel Laos and Cambodia for complicity, right? On that sequence across the spectrum, right? Complicity means sometimes the reference is made to the proxy veto that Cambodia has exercised inside ASEAN, and to an extent Laos as well, representing China inside Southeast Asia, so that the unanimity rule, which we may talk about later, the ASEAN way, maybe at least a consensus rule, means that a single country inside Southeast Asia can say, no, we don't agree. And therefore, a criticism of China will not be conveyed, will not be adopted. That obviously is a crippling relationship. And for a leading thinker on Singapore's policy and Southeast Asia international relations generally, to actually suggest that could possibly happen. I'm not saying he's recommending it. And frankly, it would be very difficult, given the structural nature of ASEAN, to imagine the circumstances under which ASEAN could expel any member at all. The ASEAN Charter, to my knowledge, does not provide for expulsion. But this gives you an idea of the tensions inside Southeast Asia with regard to the question of how to deal with China. Now, my view, and I think it is reflected in what is, after all, in the case of The Deer and the Dragon, an edited volume. There's 16 different authors. I'm only one. And it would be unrealistic, and actually it would be unfortunate to think that all of the other 15 have lined up with the same view. No, no, no. One of the advantages, I think, of an edited book is that it does give you a variety of arguments and points of view. Nevertheless, you're right. A number of the authors, myself included, do believe that we must give adequate credit to the possibility of agency coming out of Southeast Asia vis-a-vis China, and not simply to read it in the other direction. But there's a risk here. If we construct the spectrum at one extreme, one undesirable extreme, is what we might call romantic idealism. Oh, let's be brutal, naivete, that somehow these deer, and I must specify for the audience that I don't mean Bambi, I don't mean the reindeer that are pulling Santa's sleigh at Christmas. No, I mean the mouse deer, which is the smallest four-footed mammal on Earth. Very, very small. That's why it's called a mouse deer. And it exists in real life in Malaysia, in Indonesia, although it's an increasingly disturbed, let's say, species, given the decline in the forest cover in Southeast Asia. It's also showed up actually in Vietnam. And it leads to a literature, a kind of mythic literature, a folklore in Southeast Asia, that the tiny little deer is going to defeat the giant dragon because the deer, although it's weaker and smaller, is smarter. It's clever, right? Now, if you actually look at the stories that are told about Sang Kancil, for example, in Indonesia, you will quickly discover that the reason the deer wins is because the dragon is stupid. So that already is a kind of, there's not a lot of evidence in that mythology to suggest that the deer is really smarter than the dragon. Now, at the other extreme, it seems to me, is flat out fatalism. China's going to win, game over. Don't even talk, don't have a webinar talking about Southeast Asian pushback because it's irrelevant. China is fated to dominate Southeast Asia. This is obviously a discourse that Beijing encourages, politely, diplomatically, without coming across perhaps as too arrogant, although if you're a wolf warrior diplomat, you may maybe go in that direction. And we all remember the famous statement in 2010 in Hanoi when Yang Jiechi, then the foreign minister, stands up and says, just remember, some countries are small countries and other countries, meaning like us, are big countries, right? And I think Yang Jiechi, if you asked him in the course of your career, is there anything you've ever said that you would like to retract? My guess is that if he were honest, he would say, yeah, I think I'd like to take that back, okay? But now, just to end on this note, because I don't have much time, within that spectrum, it does seem to me that there are fascinating signs of initiative, if we can put it that way, on the part of Southeast Asia, of agency. Agency not, agency sort of in the sense, for example, of, well, here's an example. If we talk about pushback from Southeast Asia, the term hedging, I'll just include this because I think it's important, and my colleagues may want to comment, often comes up. Kwek Chang Chi, for example, in Malaysia, is the leading thinker, analyst of hedging, right? Now, hedging typically, not necessarily, but typically involves hedging by having a relationship with one country that amounts to insurance, a kind of insurance, in case the relationship with the other country goes wrong. So here we have agency in the context of dealing with outside powers, which is a very different sort of strategy, if you will, than agency simply in terms of a bilateral relationship with China. And let me end finally on this. You know, I've used the word strategy. What is a strategy? Well, that would lead to another extended conversation. Suffice it to say that strategy has to at least, be premeditated, right? A conscious plan of some kind, right? That links, if possible, a means to an end. It has to have a clear objective. It should be reasonably consistent, relatively long-term. And skipping over the details of why I'm saying this, I would just begin the rest of the conversation by saying, in my opinion, and my colleagues may disagree, there are only two countries in Southeast Asia that are truly strategic with regard to China in the sense that I've been mentioning. One is Singapore and the other is Vietnam. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Don. We said thank you for the illuminating and also sobering messages. I think the reference to agency is particularly important in the Southeast Asia context, because though some countries would argue that, well, China is so big and we have to live with it, other countries, and I have heard Dr. Bilahari, whom I admire a lot, emphasizing the importance of agency, that it requires a country to be strategic and not to be lazy, and to always actively understand where their national interests lie. So that seems to be almost a founding principle for any country who wants to develop effective counter strategies to China. So Maury, it's your turn. What do you think? Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Yun. Thanks for organizing this. It's a great opportunity. So what I'm going to do is talk about a few specific countries that are trying to have a little bit more space with China and not doing so well. And then I'm going to talk about a few that are doing a bit better. I'm not going to start with Cambodia, which is the closest thing to a bandwagoner. And I think probably most people know that. Instead, I'm going to start with Laos, which wants aid and loans from China, but it is politically close to Vietnam. So it's hoping that that will work for it. But really, in recent years, it hasn't worked so well. China is a major builder of dams, a builder and lender for dams on the tributaries of the Mekong, and has also built one dam, and Thais have built another on the mainstream of the Mekong. What's most, and we could talk about the dams, there's a huge story there, but I'm going to talk about the high-speed rail, which is under construction, due to be finished in 2022. You'd think that tiny Laos with 7 million people and a GDP of something like 17 billion would have rolled over to the Chinese, but they didn't. They negotiated for well over 5 years over how much Laos would pay, over the interest rate they would be charged on the loan, and how much land China would get on each side of the railroad track. In each case, they knocked down the number substantially. Tragically, though, this is a terrible project because China itself said that if the railroad was completed, all the way to Singapore, Thailand, going from Laos, Thailand to Malaysia. It would take 11 years for them to be able to break even on the railroad. But Thailand has said they're not going to do it for at least the next 10 years. So Laos is in a real pickle. They've going to be investing in this thing, and it's, they have not much besides sticky rice and mangoes they can send up to Kunming. It gets the story gets even more depressing. In September, Laos got way over its head in debt, and it turned over the state-owned EDL. It's the power grid company, state-owned power grid company, to China's Southern Power Grid. The World Bank estimated in June that Laos was 68% of its GDP. Its debt was 68% of GDP. Much of that, over half, is owed to China, which now that Laos has turned over one of its key companies to China because it can't make payments, it's going to become even more beholden and dependent. It's a terrible precedent. I thought China would learn from the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, but it seems they didn't. The IMF offered to come in, but I think China and Laos agreed that was not a good idea. And then there's another issue, that's sovereignty. Laos has turned over 2 giant swaths of land to Chinese companies, one in Botan, a special economic zone, and another is for the Blue Shield Casino owned by King's Roman Group. And although Laos has a small stake in these projects, I don't see how these special economic zones benefit Laos. They're geared to Chinese tourists. They hire mainly Chinese, and there's major speculation that Laos, the only reason it agreed is because to this major breach of sovereignty is because of huge bribes and kickbacks going to senior officials. Laos is in a bit of a pickle, I'd say. Myanmar, and I'll use this other example, it is also quite dependent. It was for years after 1988 quite dependent on China, is basically its only source of trade and aid, although it started to soften in recent years before 2011. But in 2011, Myanmar, the military junta launched some reforms and loosened its dependence on China, tried to negotiate with, tried to get closer to the US. It canceled the Keystone Dam in Kachin, which China was building, and China is still frustrated about it. Its ambassadors can't seem to let a month go by which they don't nag about that issue. But after the 2017 expulsion of the Rohingya from Myanmar, when the US and EU really came down hard on Myanmar, Myanmar turned increasingly back to China for some support. But some of the big projects like the Chakpyu Dam the Chakpyu Port on the Indian Ocean, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, Myanmar with help from US and Western experts has really pushed back on these projects and Myanmar has gotten China to reduce some of the size of the projects. But the other thing which in Myanmar is also an issue is long-term sovereignty, because there are tens of thousands and a spontaneous migration of Chinese into northern Myanmar. I think what I'm going to do, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to switch to 2 countries that I think did pretty well. One, Dawn mentioned already, is Vietnam. It's a pretty hard balancer, I guess, against China. Probably no country in Southeast Asia has a longer history. Vietnam was once a colony for almost 1,000 years. But as China has stepped up its pressure in the South China Sea since 2019 on Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines, Vietnam has turned increasingly to the US. And it allows some US ship visits. It accepts some low-key equipment from the US for its Coast Guard and its Navy, but it does no naval exercises and hasn't purchased any US military power, despite constant rumors that it might be looking to do that. But it looks really very diligently at trading and economic ties with both China and the US. China is the biggest importer for Vietnam, and the US is the biggest acceptor of Vietnamese exports. Vietnam accepts Chinese investment in some sectors, but it is absolutely uninterested in the famous Belt and Road projects because it wants to really reduce and limit its dependence. It has rejected a role for Huawei in 5G development. And although politically and party-wise, it bends over backwards not to irritate China, constantly looks over its shoulder if it's gone too far with the US. If it thinks China's getting irritated, it gives China something. But and then in the South China Sea, it is also the most rigorous in standing up to China. Vietnam doesn't have any, it can't hold a light to China's military firepower in its naval fleet, but it uses guerrilla kind of harassment tactics against Chinese Coast Guard vessels and maritime militia vessels that harass its oil and gas activities in the South China Sea. It's Vietnam is worried China wants to take over all the resources, all the hydrocarbons within the 9-dash line. And so it's fighting really for its economic future. I'm going to probably conclude with a few comments on Indonesia, which I think has also done a pretty good job. Singapore may be better, but it's also got a little bit easier task. But Indonesia is probably the most fiercely independent country in Southeast Asia. It's also the biggest, got 260 million people. Its GDP is almost 50% of Southeast Asia, but it's neither in Beijing's or Washington's camp. There's lots of suspicions against China in Indonesia, dating back to the 1965 coup, in which there are all kinds of allegations about China's role in that coup. And there's also a lot of domestic concern about Chinese workers. And sometimes it's made up. I saw an article when I was doing research on my book that there were, in one project alone, there are 1 million, by the reputable Jakarta Post, 1 million ethnic Chinese working on just one project. I don't know how they would manage that, but anyway, that's a little bit of hyperbole that shows how strongly they feel. Now, one thing that has changed is that Jokowi, Joko Widodo, who's the current president, really wanted to boost, he's really focused on building the domestic infrastructure. And he really thinks he needs China's help to do this. He's buying more military. Well, one thing that's interesting about Jokowi's infrastructure, however, is that it's all far away. It's in Sumatra, Sulawesi, Kalimantan. It's way far away from the Java and Jakarta, where the biggest bulk of population lives. It's also buying some military equipment from the US. But when the US reportedly, I don't think this has been confirmed, but when it asked Indonesia if it could fly P-3s out of Indonesia, Jakarta, about a couple of weeks ago, Jakarta turned it down. Recently, Prabowo, the defense minister, the former general who was barred from visiting the US for over 20 years, he visited Washington last week and had a good visit, but it looks like, But in Indonesia, the Trump is held at arm's length, largely because of the Middle East policies and the treatment of Palestinians. I think I'm going to stop there. I think my time is up, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Murray, for that very illuminating discussion on at least 4 cases that we're seeing in Southeast Asia: Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and then Indonesia. And each country has developed a very unique strategy according to their national endowment and also their national needs. vis-a-vis China. So last but not least, I would like to turn to Josh, my co-host and discussant. So Josh, I know that you have been working on the book on China's soft power influence in Southeast Asia. So from your perspective, how successful China has been in terms of pushing its agenda in the region? Do you see more success or failures? Do you see Southeast Asians pushing back? Do you agree with the assessment that has been provided so far by Dong and Mori? Thank you, Josh.
Okay, thanks, and thanks for having me, Yun. My book is actually about soft and sharp power, so it's about sort of both aspects. But I think that China has been fairly successful until recently in some aspects of its soft power in the region. And those include a couple of different things I'm going to talk about. I think it's been fairly successful, particularly in mainland Southeast Asia, in obtaining more influence over the media environment in those countries through a range of ways. One, by having Xinhua sign partnerships with a number of local media outlets in a number of those countries. Xinhua is positioning itself as a potential long-term competitor of Reuters and the Associated Press, and it has an appeal to some news editors and news outlets, especially in developing countries, because it provides a significant amount of copy. It's very cheap or often given away free as compared to the other news wires. And so you've seen quite a lot of new partnerships signed between Xinhua and news outlets in Thailand, as well as in some of the other countries in the region. China's also invested a fairly significant amount of money in places like Cambodia in supporting local media outlets in Cambodia, like Fresh News, some of which tend to be not only aligned with Hun Sen or very favorable to Hun Sen, but also tend to be fairly supportive of sort of China's overall foreign policy and China's approach to Cambodia. The Chinese government has also spent a fairly significant amount of money on journalist training programs in Southeast Asia, not only in mainland Southeast Asia, which is, excepting Vietnam, the region that's generally the most favorable to Chinese soft power and to China's influence overall, but also in mainland Southeast Asia. China has spent a fairly significant amount of money attracting journalists on both short courses and longer training programs. And some of these have the effect of sort of presenting China in ways that the Chinese government wants to. Some of them may have the specific effect of trying to massage and shift minds on one or two specific issues. So like a good example of that would be Chinese government has had an all-out really PR campaign towards journalists and opinion leaders in Indonesia to convince them, and not just journalists, but religious leaders, other civil society leaders, to convince them to either actually change their mind about the scale of abuses that's happening in Xinjiang, or if they haven't changed their mind, to at least downplay them when they return home and speak, offer no significant criticisms of them. And I think there's been a fairly substantial amount of media reporting showing that this campaign has been fairly successful. It doesn't mean that China has effaced the discussion of Xinjiang in Indonesia, but they have fairly substantially and effectively deployed both trips and other incentives to really reduce the amount of discussion of Xinjiang in the elite media and among religious leaders in Indonesia as well. A second sort of tranche of China's approach has been to use media influence to more effectively shape messaging in Southeast Asia, not only by journalist training and programs for foreign media, but also by more effectively, at least until this recent sort of outbreak of wolf warrior diplomacy, more effectively using foreign ministry spokespeople, ambassadors, and others. And Aid Data has done some good work on how China has used these key opinion leaders by placing them, getting them to place op-eds in local media, getting them to place pieces in local Chinese language media, and using them as sort of broadcasters of broader messages towards individual Southeast Asian countries and towards the region more generally. And I think they've had a fairly significant amount of success until recently, I think, in using these ambassadors as another form of soft power using them to sort of legitimize a number of China's themes towards Southeast Asia, as well as in a more sort of new approach that China wasn't as focused on in the past, increasingly using all of these tools to try to delegitimize the US, poke at the US and other democracies on a range of areas, including the US's admittedly abysmal response to COVID, some of the failures of other democracies to respond to COVID, the protests within the United States over racial issues and other social justice issues. So China's messaging in Southeast Asia and other regions has moved in some direction away from simply the traditional aims of bolstering ties, emphasizing that China was a good neighbor, and in the past at least, one that supported state sovereignty, supporting economic ties, et cetera, to one that is inching closer to a sort of Russian strategy of combining those with trolling and outright sort of dismissing of major democratic powers. A third tranche of that, and I'm not going to go to all of them, we can talk about 15 different tranches of China's soft power, but a third tranche that has had some effectiveness is that we may have more effectiveness given the COVID and the unpalatability of Chinese students to come to the US and even to some other major education markets. But a third tranche has been attracting foreign university students, not just from Southeast Asia, from Africa, from Pakistan, from other developing regions to China, often with some significant stipends and financial assistance, and then using them as kind of brand ambassadors when they return home. It's not a new strategy. The United States has often in the past put a lot of value in, at least until recently, in having, in Australia, New Zealand, Canada as well, in having large numbers of foreign students generally, and also particularly trying to make studying in the United States attractive for certain types of opinion leaders, and the idea that those opinion leaders would go home and generally have a relatively positive image of the United States, and that might, if they were to go into government or the military or business, that might alter how they think about the United States. And I think China has taken up that approach. It's not some sort of fail-safe. In my book, I talk about how China has brought a lot of journalism students from countries that are poorer than China but have freer press environments. And while some of the students were very impressed by China's development and other things, others found abhorrent the way that the Xi administration has increasingly cracked down on press freedom, and were shocked by how much worse the press environment was in China than in their own countries. Like, even though there are countries like Kenya, Malawi, some of the other ones, and we're straying a little from Southeast Asia here, but are much poorer than China. The press environment is much freer. But still, that's been a third tranche of sort of China's approach, soft power approach. But the final point I want to make is that, I do want to add, but I don't want to go into this in great detail because it becomes quite confusing in Southeast Asia, that China has invested a substantial diplomatic effort in cultivating local ethnic Chinese business organizations and cultural organizations and student organizations in Southeast Asia, as well as in other parts of the world, both in sort of more open, accessible ways and also in more covert ways, utilizing the United Front. But the final point I want to make, which I think is relevant here, is I do think a lot of these efforts have had a fair amount of success, at least in mainland Southeast Asia and some other countries, at tamping down concerns about China's diplomacy, military strategy, and other efforts writ large in Southeast Asia, not effacing them and having some effect. But in the last 6 months, I think China has set a lot of these soft power efforts up in smoke. And I think it has done so in several ways. One, it has, while giving out some health aid in the region, it has at the same time not shown a lot of regional countries that in a time of panic and a global emergency that it would back down on some of its territorial claims. In fact, in some cases, including the South China Sea and the Indian border, China seems to be pushing its claims even farther and more aggressively. That doesn't go over well in the region. Second, the whole wolf warrior diplomacy, which we saw previews of it, as was mentioned, with ASEAN in the early 2010s. If it was ever a time that was sort of inappropriate for it, it would be now. Third, I think clearly in some parts of Southeast Asia, places where there countries are freer, or the Chinese government's approach to Hong Kong dating back a year, but certainly amped up in the last 6 months, has not been effective in promoting its public image. Obviously, it's not effective among sort of groups like the Thai pro-democracy movement. It's not effective among sort of Malaysians who are generally aligned with the PKR, who are uneasy or outright distasteful seeing how China is approaching Hong Kong. So in a variety of ways, I think China's actually squandered a fair amount of capital that it had amassed both through soft power and also, to be fair, through effective management of COVID, very effective management of COVID after its initial obvious problems with COVID. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you for your insights. We look forward to your book. And I think it will be particularly interesting to hear how Southeast Asian countries or the Southeast Asian civil society perceives these Chinese attempt of the influence campaign and are also trying to push back to the Chinese agenda. So we have about 25 minutes left for Q&A for our audience. If you could type in your questions into the Q&A box on the Zoom channel, it will be received immediately by our researchers. And to begin with, one question that I would like to pose is the power of collectivism as well as the external players in terms of harnessing China's hegemonic ambition and behaviors. So all of you, Dong, at the beginning, you mentioned about ASEAN's inability to have to basically follow both the consensus-based approach and at the same time come up with effective solutions to the security challenges that the region faces in terms of China. So using South China Sea as an example, do you see that ASEAN or US playing an effective role in addressing the regional security challenges from China? So some in the region have criticized US for overwhelming focus on FONOP and only FONOP, and also criticized ASEAN as a talk shop, where the consensus-based approach has failed to generate effective solution. So where do you see as the most effective solution out of the current stalemate, where China can basically control the pace and conclusion of the COC? Maybe the answer lies in minilateralism, with and what role the United States could play in that process. So Dong, if I may invite you to share your thoughts first. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm happy to do so. And if I may begin with a comment on what has just been said. Murray's absolutely right. If we look at agency in terms of what some of the mouse deer, not all of them, have been able to do in their negotiations with China to resist China's demands, I think that's quite encouraging from the standpoint. If we're cheering for the mouse deer, now, maybe, I don't know, maybe some of us are cheering for China. I'm not. If we're cheering for the mouse deer, I think it's important to recognize that. I mean, something as simple as delay. Take, for example, the Thai-China relationship, right? So China comes in and says, well, we want this in terms of the railroad, for example, right? From Kunming to Singapore, ideally from their point of view, right? We want this, right? We want to, anyway, all of these demands, right? And the Thais, instead of saying no, say, well, we'll take that into consideration. So we're going to have a committee that's going to be meeting, in a couple of weeks to talk about that. And let's get back to you, when we're ready, right? Which translates into delay. Delaying a negotiation and resisting, therefore, simply through the clock, right? It's not sort of no, it's we'll think about it, right? I think you can duplicate that tactic. It's not really a strategy, it's a tactic in other countries in Southeast Asia. But the real question here is, where is the strategic autonomy? The strategic autonomy of one country, let's say Vietnam, it seems to me is relatively clear. It's not what Vietnam would like it to be because they're under such pressure from China. But in other words, the beneficiary of that particular, to use the term from the title of our webinar, counter-strategy, the beneficiary is the individual country. What makes Bilahadi's comment so interesting to me is not only that he made it, and let's be clear, he is not recommending the expulsion of Cambodia and Laos, but he is recognizing what amounts to regional strategic autonomy. In other words, which countries in Southeast Asia are actually behaving in the interest of the region, as opposed to their own, perhaps short-term bilateral interest in dealing with China. Now that, it seems to me, is an absolutely critical question that is often ignored in the emphasis on bilateral relations. Let's take Indonesia. Now, Joss is right. Indonesia is terribly important. The chapter that Johannes Suleiman has written for Deer and the Dragon, for the book that I edited, makes the argument that Indonesia has no strategy at all, really, in dealing with China, in particular because they are the natural leader of ASEAN, and for many, many, many years were thought as such, and to some extent played that role. I could give you examples. But instead, Jokowi is focused monomaniacally on the economy, right? On infrastructure. After all, he was a furniture salesman. You know, furniture is big. You can't put it on the back of a bicycle. So how do you move a bed or a sofa from, you know, northern Sumatra all the way to eastern Indonesia? That's what has animated him as a business person. And frankly, here's an example of agency that is of a negative kind. There's all kinds of agency. We have to keep in mind how complex the term really is. Let's look at what happened just recently when China, the defense minister, comes from China and says, oh, you know, he doesn't, I mean, I wasn't there, right? And I haven't read a direct quote, but essentially his objective was to see if he could make an arrangement with Indonesia that some base in Indonesia, military base, might possibly be used by China, right? And then in comes the American Secretary of State, right? Who basically wonders, you know, quote unquote, if Indonesia might possibly allow the Americans to refuel P-8 reconnaissance aircraft that would then fly over the South China Sea to land on an Indonesian base and refuel and so forth. Now, Indonesia said no to both offers. This is the neutral position. It is agency, yes, it is agency, but it's not proactive agency in the sense that Indonesia says, well, you know, we're really worried about the North Natuna Sea because your fishermen from China are coming down and exhausting the stock, and our fishermen can't catch fish, right? No, they're not dealing with that at all. It's a negative to keep the position between China and the United States. That strategy, it's not exactly a pox on both of your houses. No, that would be unfair. But it's a negative strategy. So the question is, well, what is Indonesia actually going to do? The individual who actually had a proactive and creative policy in mind with regard to the South China Sea has been banished to the embassy of a country that is not an irrelevant country in this context, but to get him out of Jakarta, which illustrates how difficult it is for individuals in Indonesia, within the regime and outside the regime, to actually generate creative ideas for dealing with China, particularly on the South China Sea. And specifically with regard to the South China Sea, ASEAN is unable to do anything that is meaningful, at least in a reasonably, you know, short-term basis, to try to resolve the situation in the South China Sea, because China has successfully split ASEAN. And this leads us into a final comment that I want to make. We think at our peril of Southeast Asia as a single region. Yes, it is on the map a single region. But how about this? What is the likelihood that 5, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, the question will not be, has Southeast Asia succumbed to China, or has Southeast Asia risen up against China, but rather has Southeast Asia survived as a single entity? Insofar as the northern tier, particularly I think Cambodia, Laos, perhaps also Myanmar, not Vietnam for historical reasons that Murray mentioned, that northern tier, both through geographical proximity, demographic penetration, economic dependence, I could go on, is at risk of becoming part of a greater China. Conversely, the maritime zone, the Philippines being an odd and erratic exception, the maritime zone might end up actually preserving some semblance of a unified, or at least a coordinated position. So that the notion that ASEAN might someday shrink, even though in legal terms, it's impossible, you know, within the charter. Nevertheless, in realpolitik terms, that might well happen.
Wow, thank you, Don, for that gloomy message, but you do raise a very real possibility that ASEAN or Southeast Asia region as a whole might become quite divided, as it has been. And for the years to come, we see this trend of division might very possibly deepen and exacerbate. I wonder whether Maury and Josh have any reaction to that assessment.
I think that was a great overview. And since there's so many questions, I'd be happy to.
Thank you. Maury, do you have anything to add?
I think I agree with Josh that was Don was very comprehensive. I think the one thing that would be worth mentioning is that there is a possibility. It won't necessarily happen, but along the Mekong, China with all its dams is blocking an awful lot of water, which is causing drought for the last 2 years downstream. We could talk in great length about that, but let's leave it for now. But Cambodia is going to suffer from this because the Tonle Sap, the lake that expands during rainy season and fish move in and then fish move out during the dry season, is going to be hurt tremendously, and all the people that fish and farm along the river. So I think there might be a possibility that Vietnam and Thailand, who are both kind of irritated at China on the Mekong, if they would together put pressure on Cambodia and Laos, Cambodia is going to lose at least as much as it's getting from China by what China's actions. If they would just wake up and smell the coffee, maybe they could be cajoled into you support us on the Mekong, I'll support you on the South China Sea. That's a bit of a really fancy negotiating tactic, but it potentially could work. I don't know.
Thank you, Maury. I think the Mekong issue is certainly a key issue for mainland Southeast Asia, and it relates to the question that Don raised, that whether maybe some countries in mainland Southeast Asia will eventually be peeled away from ASEAN as a whole, as an organization. And my colleagues here at Stimson, the Southeast Asia program, has been doing great work on this topic. So please feel free to look into our publications and our other events on this topic. So we have a very long list of questions, and we have combined some of them. So we'll try to ask as many as we could. To begin with, I think there are a couple of questions about the role that the United States plays in Southeast Asia, because no matter how we define it, U.S. as an important counterbalancer, or at least in the views of Southeast Asian countries, to neutralize China's behavior and influence. So the question goes, do we expect a more active role of the United States in the region under a Biden administration? And what would policy changes under a potential second Trump term be even possible? Because the assumption is some of the Southeast Asia regions has distrust against both the United States and China, and this have had a long-term impact on the more autonomous ASEAN community. So I wonder, any of you would like to address that question? Thank you.
Well, I'd be happy to start, even though domestic American politics is not my strong suit. I have to admit that. Okay, let me try to be a little provocative. I think the answer to your question may depend on speaking of internal unity, on the internal unity of the Democratic Party, if Biden wins. I mean, just before we began, I gathered that there's a Washington Post poll that shows that Biden is ahead in Wisconsin by 17%. Now, maybe we shouldn't trust the poll. It's the Washington Post after all. But let's imagine that Biden wins. And obviously it depends on whether or not he takes the Senate as well as the White House. There is a diversity of view inside the list of individuals. It's a long list, and who knows exactly who's going to play which role, and I don't want to get into personalities or anything like that. But essentially, it is possible that a group of individuals with background in the State Department who were instrumental in the Obama policy with regard to, let's say, the South China Sea during the Obama administration might be back in power and might be tempted in a direction that I would call excessively transactional. What do I mean by that? Because there's so many issues involved. We haven't talked about COVID. We haven't talked about global warming. And these are issues on which China can help the world, can help the United States. So understandably, the new administration, if it is a Biden administration, is not going to want to narrow everything down to the South China Sea. That doesn't make any sense at all. Not at all. But will it be the case that the Americans will pull their punches, not just literally, but diplomatically, for fear of alienating Beijing because they think they need Beijing with regard to these other issues, whether it's COVID or other matters, right? In which case the South China Sea becomes a kind of a counter on the game board that you can play in return for certain advantages. Now, we know from the Obama administration that the failure to live up to certain red lines in the South China Sea actually ended up, if I may say so, facilitating Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. They got away with it. Now, okay, water under the bridge, but let's not have the same water go under the bridge a second time.
I would have to disagree with that, like pretty much 100%. So, I mean, at CFR, we have a lot of interaction with the domestic policy community, including with a number of people who actually have gone to work with Biden's campaign. I don't think that there's going to be that much disjunction, disunity between Trump's China policy and a potential Biden presidency, including on the South China Sea. I think that many of the people, well, first of all, just to go back, sure, the Democratic Party is a wider collection of interest groups and a more heterogeneous party than the Republican Party at this point. But in terms of foreign policy, that heterogeneity doesn't really reflect that much on Southeast Asia. It reflects on a whole range of other things, including taxes, social welfare programs, climate change, approach to all sorts of US social issues, but very low down on the list would be the approach to Southeast Asia, which is going to, I think, remain in the hands of a small number of personnel. And I think there's been a dramatic shift, and you can see about reflecting by who is leading Biden's campaign team, Asia policy. You can make a strong and sort of guess that if Biden wins, those people will be in senior jobs ranging from the prominent jobs at the Defense Department to things like Deputy Secretary of State or on the NSC, that there will be a continuation of a fairly hawkish China policy. It might not be delivered in the same way as Donald Trump, but I see very little disjunction between a potential second-term Biden policy. And there are other reasons for that too. There's been a complete reversal in the Democratic Party's sort of foreign policy establishment. And there's been multiple articles published about thinking that they got China wrong in the Obama administration. And so you're going to see, I think, a counter reaction to that. Secondly, I also think that overall, if Biden were to win, a lot of people in the Democratic foreign policy establishments would probably see this as the last chance to restore some sort of coherent US foreign policy in a whole range of issues. And if they lose to another sort of populist, maybe call them an illiberal populist, that the US's foreign policy is sort of, our sort of traditional internationalist foreign policy is done for good. So I would see a continuation in China policy. Yes, there may be some differences. The US under Biden would clearly try to re-engage with the world on climate change, and that means re-engaging with China on climate change and all sorts of other countries. But I don't see that much disunity on a whole range of issues, including the South China Sea. And in fact, I think there's going to be, in some ways, an even more hawkish approach because there will be pressure on them to take a stronger stand. In terms of related to Southeast Asia, I think the small number of areas where a Biden administration could differ is on issues like of non-traditional security, which is a huge grab bag. But one, obviously, climate change, which is one that's of extreme importance to Southeast Asia since it's one of the regions of the world most directly affected by climate change and most imminently affected by massive climate change. Two, some potential that a Biden administration might restore some efforts to negotiate regional trade deals, or at least be involved in sort of regional trade integration that has gone on without the United States for the last 4 years. But even that I'm dubious of, because there you have a lot of cross currents within the Democratic Party that don't exist on issues like the South China Sea, which are pretty much left to a small group of personnel, but maybe some re-engagement on regional trade and some sort of cosmetic efforts to focus on ASEAN as an organization in a way that the Trump administration hasn't done so much. But on the big issues in which the US and China are at conflict, which carries over to Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, disconnection in sort of the world of the internet, in which China is increasingly being disconnected from the rest of the world on the internet, influence activities, spying, convincing other countries not to use major Chinese tech providers. I think the Biden administration is going to continue all of those policies.
Good, good.
Very sobering assessment. Muri, do you have anything to add on this next administration policy perspective?
No, I think we've got the two poles that people are talking about represented already. So I'll pass.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move on to the next group of questions. It's about the alternative partners available to Southeast Asia. So it's not just US and China, and we see that the region has very high expectations out of Japan, very high expectations out of EU. So Muri, maybe I could start with you. How would you assess the potential of alternative partners like Japan and EU to perhaps provide some additional possibility and alternatives to Southeast Asia?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, you very much see Southeast Asia really courting Japan as a source of potentially at least some alternative funding and building of infrastructure. They're a major trading partner for many of the countries, major investors in manufacturing, that kind of stuff. And the EU is also important. Some countries have done free trade agreements with the EU. Some ASEAN is looking at doing some regional ones with the EU. And so I think that does provide a hedge against when they don't entirely trust either China or the United States. And then of course there's India, which the Southeast Asians are always concerned that India underperforms and is always late on many of these things. But now that China has tweaked them in the border region, there's an article in the FT today saying that India plans to step up its efforts in the sea, although it's still far behind where China is. And then there's also Australia, which at least with Indonesia and some of the maritime countries and also on the Mekong plays a significant role. So those countries matter. South Korea is an increasingly important investor. So there are a number of countries that Southeast Asia can look to for at least a partial hedge.
Thank you. Dong, if there's a question specifically addressed to you, and if I may ask you to answer that, the question specifically about why and in what way that Singapore and Vietnam are the ones with the most strategic plans towards China. I think that's a question that it's an observation that people make, but rarely do people think very hard into the rationale behind it. Would you like to elaborate? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Just a quick comment on the previous conversation, if I could, and that is that it seems to me that there is room for a great deal of creativity, of imaginative thinking, if it is going to be a Biden administration, with regard, for example, not just to the Quad, but to a Quad plus. Is the Quad possibly a kind of basis for enlarging cooperation, perhaps even conceivably eventually some relatively anodyne, perhaps, cooperation with countries in Southeast Asia? Or is that doomed because, of course, China is going to attack it as an Asian NATO and so forth, and Southeast Asian countries, witness the example of Indonesia, are going to be very reluctant to get involved in those kinds of arrangements. But there's possibility for bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral, all kinds of mini-lateral arrangements, I think, should be open and on the table. Now, with regard to the question that was asked, here's what I would say. To my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, in no country on earth is there a special unit devoted to futurology, pure futurology, that reports directly to the head of state, well, to the prime minister in this case, right? That's Singapore. Singapore is unique. The ambition to exercise at least intellectual control, right? You know, the synoptic approach, right? This is not checkers, it's not Go, it's chess, right? Long run chess. And with regard to Vietnam, the historical lesson that has been dealt to Vietnam, given its relations with China, the fact that it was able to maintain its own unique civilization, despite all of the debts that it has to Chinese civilization, including a millennium, right, of, you know, I don't know what to call it exactly, but of overseeing, let's put it that way, by China. The experience, the historical record, 1979, right, when China invaded across the northern border, right? 1988 in the South China Sea, 1974 in the South China Sea. I could go on and on. So Vietnam has learned from bitter experience. And I would even go farther, and maybe my colleagues in Southeast Asian Studies who are watching this, or colleagues here on the webinar, would disagree. But in my judgment, Vietnam has the most deep-rooted sense of national identity of any country in Southeast Asia, partly for these historical reasons. And that is a huge asset if you want to be a strategic actor internationally.
Thank you, Don. I guess the same also can be said about Singapore. The very strong national identity and also self-identity is it probably forms the core of their determination to preserve their strategic autonomy. We're running out of time, and I would love to pose the last question that combines. I'm sorry, Josh, you were going to add something. My apologies.
I was just going to add something really quickly because it hadn't come up, but I think it's, given the current environment, it's worth mentioning that all of these things, Biden administration, US policy, anything you're talking about the US, one thing we haven't mentioned is that, and I always like to inject some pessimism into any conversation. The US is completely, right, focused on, right now we have the highest number of COVID cases in the world. We have 225,000 dead people, no clear strategy going forward. Any new administration, if Biden was to take office, he would be immediately confronted by a combination of Great Depression level economic activity, a pandemic with no clear, obvious, resolution. So I think anything that we're talking about, whether it's X, Y, Z, anything, Southeast Asian and other parts of the world, has to be taken, just has to be mentioned at this point in time that the US is compromised by a whole range of domestic dysfunction. I don't even get into all the other things, extreme polarization, et cetera, et cetera. And we have to recognize that not only is that problematic, for our own domestic politics, and problematic for our global image, but it means anything that's talked about we're going to do X, Y, and Z, you have to sort of take 50% off of that, like a 50% off sale, given that the United States' ability to do anything right now, even at all in the world, is just sharply, severely limited. I just think given the environment that we live in right now, it's worth mentioning.
Absolutely, Josh. The challenges for great power, especially for the superpower, to get our own house in order, and then then maybe we will have more bandwidth, and also the exemplary effect for other regions. So before I let everybody go, I would like to pose a last short question for your thoughts, which is on the future, hopefully a solution to the South China Sea problem. Don, you and I talked a lot about what potentially need to happen. And Maury, I know you have worked on this a lot. So there's apparently the legal option, which may or may not be followed by China. There's the political option based on negotiation, but that comes to the question as for who will be involved in that political process. And then there's potentially a more hard security-based approach, but that indicated a future that is much more gloomy. So if I could ask each one of you to spend 1 minute on what you see as the most effective way forward on the South China Sea issue, that will be great. Don, would you like to start? Thank you.
Well, the most effective, that's relative. Nothing is going to be obviously effective. It's possible that nothing will be effective. But the least one can hope for is that the current situation, the status quo, however unfavorable it may be in some ways to Southeast Asia, is at least maintained and not worsened, right? I mean, imagine what would happen, and there has been some discussion that this actually could happen, if China were to take the Pratas, right? The islands in the northern portion of the South China Sea that are presently controlled by Taiwan. How would Southeast Asia react? That would have a disastrous effect, it seems to me, certainly in terms of China's image in Southeast Asia. That would be really, really unfortunate. But I think for the reasons that Josh has so eloquently outlined, if you're sitting in Beijing and you're looking at America eating its own entrails almost, you might think, this is the time to strike, okay? Now, my proposal, which I've made repeatedly with no success, and it's a trivial proposal, it has to do with words, with language. Academics love language. They exaggerate the importance of language. I'm no exception. Would be to try to persuade a number of countries, maybe starting with Japan, maybe Australia, putting together a small group of countries that would all agree to make a single sentence statement. The sentence would read, no one country should control the South China Sea. Now that would get us into a discussion of what control means, right? Which would be good, which would be great. That's not a discussion that's taking place right now. Are there degrees of influence short of control that would be acceptable to the literal countries in Southeast Asia and also to the United States, Australia, and so forth, India, right? At least it would get a discussion going. That's what academics love, right? Remember that, discussion, right? But in addition to that, it seems to me I'm encouraged by what Josh said with regard to the probability of using a transactional approach to Southeast Asia, which could be quite damaging to Southeast Asia's interests. I'm encouraged by that. And I do feel, on the other hand, another point of view here, why not get together? Again, it would probably be done on track 3 or track 2, maybe not track 1, and say, look, what are the reasonable interests that China should have? Not their core interests, which may include controlling the South China Sea, but the reasonable interest that China is, after all, they have roughly 20% of the coastline around the South China Sea. They deserve to be at the table, obviously, right? So that might lead us, and for that matter, what are the American interests in the South China Sea? And are they really antagonistic to China's interests? If so, in what precise ways? And what can we do about that? Again, I'm an academic, so I'm talking from the ivory tower, unfortunately, but I think those would help.
Very wise words, very wise. Murray, your wisdom, please.
Well, like Don, I'm pretty pessimistic that there's an easy solution anytime soon. I think one thing that would be helpful is if the Southeast Asians, even the Southeast Asian claimants, could start to deal with their own overlapping claims and show China that there is some way to settle some of this. But they're not even, Malaysia and Vietnam have been harassed half to death. Well, it's an exaggeration, but harassed very severely in their oil exploration activities last year and this year. They don't even talk to each other. They really got to sit down and talk and then try to figure out their own differences. And I think if China realized that the Southeast Asians were cooperating and might have a unified view on the code of conduct, for example, China might be more amenable to try to find some way, because China doesn't really like it if their whole neighborhood hates them. And so they might try to accommodate, at least on paper. But I'm in the short run, I'm quite pessimistic.
Thank you, Maureen. So basically, the power of a unified regional voice, even just a few members of the region, that could be very conducive. Josh, the last words are yours.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that much else to say. I mean, I think I agree that it's not promising. I agree that, sorry, I'm just taking my notes, that better cooperation from the Southeast Asians might push China to be more accommodating on code of conduct and come up with something that's at least a document, even though I'm not sure they would agree with that. I do agree with Murray that China, it rolls off China's back if the US criticizes China about certain things, but they really don't like neighbors in Southeast Asia, slamming them or being extremely unhappy publicly. So I think that has some prospects. I don't think a legal option is effective at all. Especially because, it would need, the Southeast Asians would need support from the US, and the US at this point hasn't shown much interest in supporting global legal institutions, certainly not in the Trump administration. So I do think the Southeast Asians cooperating to push towards some code of conduct that they can hold up is potentially valuable, but I still believe that actually that's not really going to deter China, and that the only real deterrence is a more aggressive hard security approach by Vietnam, Singapore, and other actors in the region aligned with the US, Australia, Japan, and India.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Thanks to the three panelists for their wonderful remarks and a very thoughtful assessment of where we are in terms of Southeast Asia's counter strategies to China. We also would like to take the opportunity to thank our audience for your great questions and for your participation. Please stay tuned for other events and Asia-related discussions we have here at Stimson. Thank you very much. With that, we successfully complete today's session. Thank you and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.